Hi everyone. I'm making this video to talk a little bit about Community Engagement Toolkit 4, and the idea is just essentially to give you guys some guidance about how to successfully complete that assignment. So let's get started. The first thing I want to say is don't panic. I know that most of you, if not all of you, are going to be new to creating a map, and we are aware of that is something that we expect. So it's important to understand that this is a practice exercise. It's about learning a skill rather than about getting it exactly right or doing it perfectly. So don't think that everything has to be perfect. The process of creating your map is equally as important or even more important than the final outcome. And also remember that this is a class about community engagement. It's not really a class about mapping. Mapping is a tool that we're using, so your map doesn't have to be super complex, or it doesn't have to be something that an expert would create, right? So let's start thinking about what you're going to do. The first thing that you can do is start planning before you talk to your community members. Among several other aspects that must be included in your map, you should be talking about your environmental topic that you selected from toolkits 2 and 3, and that should be included in there, right? So some topics are good for mapping and some are not so much, because there's just not that many things that are locations or areas that are associated with them, and that is perfectly fine. You can explain that when you are writing your few paragraphs about your mapping experience. You can actually say that and explain, well, maybe participatory mapping, it's not exactly what I would use for looking at this particular aspect that I selected earlier, and that's okay. But there's also a bunch of other things that you are going to be mapping, so your map is still going to have plenty of information in it. And then the planning aspect of it has to do with thinking about what kinds of things you would include in a map that talks about your environmental issue. One thing that you can do is, if you suggested an environmental issue that is a little bit narrow, a little bit specific, you can instead broaden it a little bit for your map. So if you were thinking about recycling at first, maybe you can instead talk about waste management. Or if you're thinking about bees in particular, maybe you can be a little bit more general, talk about pollinators instead, or rather including all pollinators and pollinator related issues in your map. So a few examples of what kinds of issues you can include in your map depending on what your topic is. If you're talking about air pollution, or your topic was air pollution, you can, for example, map areas that are commonly affected, sources of pollution, asthma treatment centers, the location of concerned organizations, and so on. If you're talking about recycling, you can include the location of recycling centers, places where waste management companies are, where concerned organizations are, or even businesses that specialized on recycled products. That one, and again, recycling, maybe it's one example of those that are not exactly that obvious, that the kind of things that you might do. But just try to be creative when you're doing this. Another example, human-wildlife conflict. You might include the location of wildlife rehabilitation centers, or talking to your community, you can look at locations where community members have seen or interacted or heard from other people about the presence of wildlife that has a potential to cause conflicts. So the main idea here is just take a few minutes to think about things that you can map that are related to your work. And even if you don't come up with many, that's also okay, because again, not all topics are suitable or ideal for mapping. And then Once you have done a little bit of planning, the next thing to do is to talk to people. Right? The process of gathering information for your map starts with you talking to whoever the community members that you selected. And it can be something similar to what you did with your interviews. You can have like one-on-one talks. I highly recommend that when you're doing this, you bring a map. It makes it easier for you to mark things in your map. It might help your community members remember things that could be included in the map. And essentially it starts you in the process of thinking spatially about these issues. As an alternative, you could also do something that is more like traditional participatory mapping, in which you gather with your community members all at the same time and you create the map together. But that's optional. You can also do it one-on-one, and it's probably easier to do it that way. Now, when you actually get to creating your map, there's a few different things you can do it. You can draw your map entirely. That again is closer to traditional participatory mapping, and it's particularly good for small scales. If you're looking at your workplace or your school, or it can even be your neighborhood, that kind of thing might work, and it's good especially for highlighting places that have value to people, because those are the ones that people are more likely to remember to put in the map, or they're more likely to make them bigger with respect to others if you're not too concerned about scale. And another thing you can do instead of that, which might be easier if you don't have a lot of artistic skills, might be drawing on a map that you print, a base map. You just draw whatever relevant items together with your community, with each of your community members, or you do a map with each community member, and then you combine those two by drawing into a new base map. And finally, you can use online software. And essentially, you talk to your community members, you bring the information back to your computer, and then you just put it all in the map. And so in this video, I also want to show you guys how to make a map with Google My Maps, which is a fantastic tool, and one that in previous versions of this course people have used a lot.